Should I learn to read music to play piano? This is something a lot of people think about when they're just starting out or thinking about learning piano. I'm going to try and answer two questions. Can you and should you start learning to play piano without reading music? The first one's easy. Yes, of course you can. People do it all the time. I can read, but a ton of what I've learned has got nothing to do with reading. There's loads of famous musicians that don't read. Some piano players that I love don't use it for a lot of the things that they do. And that's the same for loads of musicians that I know too. There's some musical situations and some musical cultures and genres where reading's the complete norm, and others where you would never use that skill, or not as much. You can still speak a language without being able to read it, and music's not really any different in that respect. So yes, you absolutely can, and if anyone tells you you can't, I'm sorry, but they're just objectively wrong, because people do. Anyway, the second question is what the video is really about. It's much more interesting, and I want to use it to try and help you decide what is the best path for you. Discuss where and how reading can help you learn, what you need it for, what you probably don't need it for, or maybe shouldn't use it for. What are the benefits of reading music, or are there any downsides? Or more specifically, are there any downsides to how and when you learn it, or if you only learn that way? There's some players that only learn to read and can maybe play pretty well, but if you take the sheet music away from them, then they haven't got a clue what to do with the piano, which is perfectly fine for some people, but for others, like me and maybe you too, that's not always enough. Right now, you might just want to play a few of your favourite pieces, but the deeper you get into music and develop more of a taste for it, you might end up wanting to get a bit more out of it. Tell me in the comments, because I'd be really interested to know what your musical goals are, or what route you've taken in the past and what worked and what didn't for you. Let me just quickly explain the difference between reading music and sight reading music, because not everyone just getting started realizes that they're not exactly the same thing. Reading music is basically being able to figure out how to play something from the sheet. What notes the dots on the stave mean, how to fit it together rhythmically and how to perform it. Essentially being able to realise what's on the page and bring the music to life. So sight reading is being able to do all of that just at first sight on the first go, which is obviously much more difficult. When people are using sheet music, they might be sight reading, but a lot of the time they're reading or kind of skim reading. They've rehearsed it already and already kind of familiar with how to play it. Now there's obviously a spectrum there between being pretty close to sight reading and pretty much knowing the whole thing already. And then there's just being able to learn something from a bit of sheet music and memorising it bit by bit, even if that's really slow. Even if you can sight read to a really high level, people often still want to memorise things. And the faster you can read something, the easier it's going to be to learn and memorise too. So even if you're reading really slowly, being able to learn something from a piece of sheet music, in some cases, particularly with classical music, is a really useful tool to have and can be the most practical way of finding out how to play something. Sometimes for some people, it can be the clearest learning method, and once you start getting more experience with it, it often lets you learn new pieces of certain kinds of music much quicker, which in turn then accelerates your progress. Depending on what musical avenues you want to take in the future, being able to read well can sometimes be expected or even completely essential. In the classical world, it's common practice. Sometimes in things like big band jazz and musical theatre, you'll use it. And if you want to be a session player too, it might come in handy. Obviously, if you just want to play for yourself at home, then that stuff doesn't quite carry the same weight. But if you want to get into those worlds one day, then it's something worth thinking about. The tradition of playing something like classical music is to perform it exactly as it was written, note for note. Obviously, different players still interpret the performance in their own way, but here learning by reading music probably trumps learning by ear because of speed and accuracy when the music gets more complex. By the way, classical music did often used to have an improvisational element to it and sometimes still does. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in classical music, but after this video you should check out this one to learn more about that. A good ear and listening ability and some theory knowledge and stuff like that too are still really important to work on alongside learning to read. These will help develop the sound of your playing and the rate of your progress. This is something that people who only learn to read do sometimes miss out. Whether you're reading a lot or not at all, you still need to be listening loads to proficient players in whatever style you're trying to learn to pick up other elements of the language like phrasing and touch. There's a lot of nuance you can't really get from a page and you just have to pick up naturally through experience and active listening. It's like copying an accent or doing an impression of someone. It's pretty hard to describe on paper and get someone to recreate it accurately, But if you just listen to it loads and practice, you'll get the gist, and then eventually it's going to sound authentic. And you can do that with music too, and then start developing your own sound. And this shouldn't really exclude anyone who wants to play something like classical music but really struggles with reading or really doesn't want to learn, because you can still learn to play really well through other methods like a teacher showing you things or video tutorials. It's even useful to do a bit of that anyway, because you can see how players move around the piano and learn from that. The sheet is just a source of information and instructions on what to play, but if it sounds great anyway, no one listening cares where you got the instructions from. Having said that though, if you can manage to learn both ways, you'll end up being a more versatile player and you might have more opportunities in the future. Reading basically unlocks a new way of learning, which can only be a good thing really, and it gives you access to a whole history of music. There's a lot of good video tutorials as well for things like classical music and whatever else you want to learn, but the library of sheet music is a lot bigger for certain things. It can be handy just to have a piece of paper right in front of you that you can easily look at to find out how to play something. Check you have something right, or remind you how to play a specific section. You can like scan through to the bit you want pretty quickly. Now all of that is a bit slow and painful to start with, but it does get quicker with experience and starts to pay off. If you're learning some music theory too, which I think you should be, at least the basics anyway, as it helps you speak the language of music more fluently, reading music can also help you make more sense of that. It can help you see patterns in music, or visualize how the harmony is working, or see how the structure of something fits together as a whole. And on a more practical level, you can connect shapes that you see on the stave with the shapes that you actually make on the piano. Things like chord shapes and inversion shapes. There's loads of little things like that that help you see the bigger picture of how music works, learn faster and become a better musician. It helps you understand better how rhythms fit together too, because you can literally see what lines up and what goes together and what doesn't. It's really like a picture of what you have to play. It's a blurry picture for a beginner, but it does eventually clear up. A reading ability helps with communication and learning music in general. Notation can help you get musical ideas across effectively to other musicians, or other musicians to you. That may be learning a new way of playing chords from someone online quicker, a new exercise from a book, the head to a jazz tune, or some bebop licks that your teacher recommended to learn. But also like passing music around to other musicians and saying things like, take a look at bar 15, then everyone knows exactly where you mean, it's nice and clear. Now there's always other alternatives. A lot of time these days people send recordings and videos and chord charts, stuff like that. But some situations it may be more useful to use traditional sheet music, so it's good to have options. It's also handy for writing your own ideas down, to pass on to someone else or just remember what you wrote. And it just provides you with a common vocabulary to discuss things with other musicians, which makes things a lot simpler and clearer a lot of the time. A lot of that you can learn without actually reading too, but for some people having a reference of the symbols and notation to work from makes it a lot easier to understand. Sheet music is a really useful tool, particularly for things like the classical world, but just don't forget that you can benefit loads from learning other things alongside it. So there's not really any direct negatives from knowing how to read music, but I feel there's some issues that you want to be aware of that you could come up against if too much emphasis is placed on reading too early on. Not everything here is going to be everyone's experience of learning to read, but I have come across these a lot and they are a problem for some people. The good thing is though that they're all avoidable if you know about them. This might seem surprising, but a lot of people I've spoken to actually don't realise that you can learn music without reading. This attitude's more the case with something like piano than say guitar, where it seems more normal to learn by ear, maybe pick something out off the radio or show a student how to play a riff or some chords. Probably because piano is more synonymous with classical music, but I don't think lessons or learning needs to be like that all the time. And for certain kinds of music, maybe piano lessons should be more like guitar lessons. I'm a firm believer in learning practically by doing, and even if you are going to go down the more classical route, for some people it can even be more beneficial to get some practical musical experience before learning to read at all. A lot of musicians like to compare music to language. I like to use that analogy too, and that's how you learn language as a child. You mimic and you learn how to do it and how it works in a more natural and intuitive way. You start simple and you get it wrong a lot, but you have meaning and purpose in what you say. And then you learn more about the rules and how to read and write later on. Then when you learn the written word, you have something to connect it to. That's the way I see it anyway, and I think that's also a great approach to learning music. There's an amazing bass player called Victor Wooten who has a really great TED video on the idea of music as a language. I'll put a link to that down in the description. Once you're already more familiar with the keyboard itself, where to find things, how to move around it, and the sounds you can make, so start speaking the language, then the sheet music connects to something that you're already comfortable with. You have a frame of reference for what the stuff on the page actually means. When you only play at your reading level, or spend too much practice time or lesson time just on reading, sometimes people can just end up spending too long playing those really dull pieces of music or nursery rhymes or some not very musical simplified arrangements of things. Obviously these things have their uses when you're specifically practicing reading skills or as exercises and starting points, but it can also be pretty uninspiring and frustrating for new students to make progress if that's all they're learning and never get to the good stuff. That doesn't mean that you should start trying to play Flight of the Bumblebee after a week of piano, by the way. If you just make sure to at least have a good balance, then you might get to some more interesting stuff quicker. There needs to be a healthy balance of your core skills, but you also got to make sure to try and have fun and get a sense of progress and musicality in what you're doing as well. Sometimes something that may be tricky to read might actually not be as difficult to play. For example, some complicated rhythms can look really confusing on the page, and you'd normally spend ages on the simpler stuff before getting anywhere near that. But people can often play those more complicated rhythms much more easily just by getting them in their head and doing it naturally. People who don't have any musical training sing or tap along to the radio all the time and do way more complicated rhythms than you'd ever start reading. There's loads of things that I learned how to play just by doing it before intellectualizing it or being able to read it. And I know loads of other people that learn a lot the same way. It can be the same with chords as well. You often read a lot of single note or two note stuff before reading full on chords. But you can learn to play thick, full sounding chords in like accompaniment sort of styles pretty quickly without reading, and still learn what the chords are and what they mean for this song too. The main thing is that some things in music for some people seem to me to be much easier to learn naturally by copying and hearing and just feeling it. And sometimes it could take ages to get to certain places if you're only reading, where you could be playing that stuff pretty quickly without. You might be missing out on some really important practical musical experience early on. And don't forget, you can always catch up with the reading side another time. There's already a lot to think about as a beginner anyway. Recognizing shapes, getting familiar with the keyboard, the sounds you can make with it, coordinating your limbs, technique stuff, and listening and anything else to do with the practical side of playing. Some people learn and some people also teach in a way that only lets players play what they can also read. I'm sure some people are going to disagree, but that makes absolutely no sense to me if that's the only thing that you're doing. That can be really limiting, and surely the main purpose is actually making the music and not just decoding something from a page. And this way you now have to get two skills to a high standard before you can play anything decent. Sometimes too much thought has to be dedicated to translating the sheet music to the piano. And as a beginner, having to think about two things that you're unfamiliar with at the same time can result in slow and rigid, awkward sounding playing. When if you were shown or working things out or memorizing bits at a time from sheet music and not having to play at the same time as reading, then that confidence and familiarity with the music and the movement helps develop a nice relaxed technique, making the music more fluid, and you can focus more of your attention on the actual sound of it and your touch on the piano, which in my opinion at least is a bit more important to start developing first. If you're struggling to think quick enough where your fingers go next and what happens next in the music, that's when you stutter. And for beginners, I've found that reading anything beyond something really boring fluently enough not to stutter is a lot harder than gradually memorizing things bit by bit. Just be careful not to get stuck stuttering for ages when perhaps you could have otherwise achieved something that sounds a lot better and more musical. And then maybe work on reading gradually more complex things at the same time as playing as a separate practice, or even a bit later on. What you can do physically on the piano, I think, is what it's really about. So once you have a better sense of that, then interpreting something from the page is going to be much easier. Your mind is then much freer to think about the musicality of something as opposed to just getting through the notes. Obviously, once you get really good at reading and playing, you can do both, but I'm really just talking about at the beginning stages. Putting all your focus on reading whilst neglecting other aspects of music like listening, ear training, improvisation, theory, and just learning how music's put together can mean you end up missing out on loads of other possibilities music has to offer. You can get really good at being able to take something from a page, but still not be able to create something for yourself. Or follow a chord sheet. Take a solo. Have have a jam with other musicians, or just play around with music as much. Reading, although obviously really important and useful, can, if you let it, distract you from learning more about why and how music works the way it does. And that's really one of the things that allows you to speak the language of music at a deeper level and not just copy. It can be really frustrating for players who can play, but can't just play. Learning just some simple chord-based music, for example piano accompaniments, is a great way to learn to hear and visualize some more basic harmony stuff and how chord progressions work. Sometimes with music that's really broken up or complicated, there can just be too much going on for a beginner to keep track of how the music's working, like when the melody uses notes from the chord or notes around the chord, that kind of thing. Or if the notes of the chord voicing are really spread out, it's hard for a beginner to visualize and realize that they're actually playing a D major, for example. Obviously still learn that stuff too, because it develops other techniques, but it's just good to make sure that you're playing stuff at a level where you can see what's happening and understand how the music's working. Learning to play without reading music is important to do as well for some people, because there's just lots of occasions where you won't need to read music, or reading would be the slower and more restricting option. And being able to just follow a chord chart, play those chords in different ways and different styles, figuring out a tune, or being able to adapt something is often expected in some musical circles, just like reading proficiently is in others. Learning to play by ear and how music works and practicing without sheet music is the way to get good at that. Plus, for lots of modern music, you won't even find decent sheet music anyway. I play in a function band, and like most people who do that kind of thing, I pretty much exclusively work everything out by ear. And this allows me to be a bit freer with what I play and adapt to different situations, maybe take a solo, experiment with the groove and the rhythm and have more fun with it. And often at a gig, the moment may require the band to take the music in a different direction, even if only something small like a slight rhythm change, but playing like this means that we can all go that way. But if we're only capable of following exactly what's on the page, then that's all that's ever going to happen. For lots of more popular music like soul, funk, rock and jazz and things like that, it's often so much easier to learn and memorize with a good ear and understanding of chords and how music works. You start seeing loads of relationships and connections between songs that use the same vocabulary. Some of the topics that I've started covering on this channel and things that I want to continue talking about are those things that are going to help you get there too. I've got a pretty in-depth guide up already on some of them, and I'll link to that video in the description. Some things, like a piece of bark's probably going to be easier to learn from the page. But often with more modern kind of chord-based music, things like chord charts and memorizing chord progressions is often a better approach. The same with things like playing the blues or jazz. Again, the sheet music can be a useful learning tool for those as well, but it's only ever going to take you so far with it. So I think it's good to play some bits of music where you're specifically practicing memorizing something complicated or focusing on a new technique, but to also play some simpler kind of chord-based stuff where you can actually understand what's happening with the music. Because if you try to do that with more complicated stuff, it's too overwhelming, and you have to build up to that slowly with the easier stuff first. If you're looking for some reading resources to help you learn, I sometimes use this series of books in my lessons with students. They've just got loads and loads of short sight reading exercises. It's useful practice for playing and reading at the same time. It doesn't really teach you how to read though. If you look at Bark Scholar's channel as well, he has some really great reading resources. But if you're after something that's going to help you start learning how to read sheet music, I haven't actually used this book myself. I've had a flick through and I've heard it recommended by lots of other channels and on Reddit a bunch of times. There's the Alfred piano book, and I'll link to that in the description. It might be worth having a look at that. Remember that different people learn better in different ways, so bear that in mind when you're telling people don't read music, it's a waste of time, or you absolutely have to read music to call yourself a musician. People have different goals too, and one route may hold someone back or even completely put them off learning, whereas the other one may help them unlock their musical potential. Reading isn't the only way to learn, and you can understand music and play music without it, but it can be a really useful tool. Just make sure it's not the only thing you focus on. All the different elements and learning methods all support each other to make your understanding of music stronger as a whole. I think the ability to be able to figure out something from a page, even if really slowly, is far more important than being able to sight read at a high level. But then the faster you can read, the easier it does make things. Remember, all the negatives I mentioned are all avoidable, and maybe you haven't experienced them, but I haven't just made them up. I'm up for everyone discussing this in the comments, but just keep it respectful. You may have just encountered something different in your world to someone else. These things have all come from conversations with students, with other musicians and teachers, things I've noticed about people and seen online too. For me, just understanding how to play and how music works is more important than being able to read. But reading can still be important for a lot of people, and a mixture of both skills is a really great thing. I hope this has helped you just think about what might be best for you. There's no perfect route for everyone to take, unfortunately. Everyone's going to be different. Let me know in the comments if it has and what approach you think you might take. Please give the video a like and subscribe for more content that's going to help you develop your piano playing. Thanks for watching.